good afternoon, everybody, and Happy New Year. Welcome back to Norfolk Constructing Excellence. My name is Warren Salmons. I'm the Chair of Constructing Excellence here in Norfolk, and it's great to see so many of you joining us today. I think we're up to about 130 on the call so far, and I guess a few more will be joining as we continue. So, yes, a very warm welcome back. And today we've got a speaker lined up for you who many of you probably have seen before and heard before, whether with us or on his various podcasts, media outlets and celebrity appearances. But we have Ed Gillespie joining us today, and he'll be going through another challenging, informative and interesting talk in a few moments' time. But I discussed this before we started the call with Ed. So I'm going to get us through some housekeeping before Ed finishes, because I guess you'll all be shooting back to your work. And while I've got your attention, I want to just say a few words about some of the things we've been doing recently and that we've got coming up. So many of you, I believe, and you can see on the list here today, that attended our event, our first Christmas event at Dragon Hall in December. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for buying raffle tickets. And thank you very much for promoting it as well. It was a great event. It's the first time we've done a Christmas social event. Wonderful setting. Many thanks to obviously the brass band that made it very Christmassy. But really a heartfelt thank to everybody who came, especially some poor soul who got railroaded at the end with an auction. But we managed to raise £2,300 for the Salvation Army Christmas Appeal, which obviously this year and most years, but especially this year, from what they've said to us, the need has never been so great for people who are in a vulnerable situation. So thank you for your support, and we aim to do exactly the same again this year with even more people and with even more money raised. So thank you for that, and look forward to seeing you in December. There we go. That's early planning, isn't it? So the big launch really today, and the big piece that I want to talk about, is the launch of our awards. So last year we had to conduct them online and put a video together. It's not quite the same as our previous awards, where we had a great night all together celebrating the success and the achievements that we've all achieved within the construction industry. So we are back and we're live in a real life event. We've managed to book Dunstan Hall. Obviously the previous venue, the Open, is not open, which does pose a problem on location, but the Dunstan Hall will serve us very well. I've been to award ceremonies there before, and we're going to have a lovely evening, and we're going to come back in style. So it's going to be black tie this year, with an evening meal, the award presentation, and just an opportunity to celebrate and network together. So it's free to enter. We've made some changes to the awards this year. We want to make it as accessible for everybody to enter a project, process, or a way of working that they've developed or achieved in the last year. And then I'll see as projects completed or underway this last year. So we've also reduced the number of categories. Believe it or not, we had 14 categories previously, and year on year in other construction excellence clubs and at the national level, they seem to keep adding extra categories. And I think it's for a commercial point of view that they just want to increase sponsorship opportunities, which for me doesn't really deliver the principles of constructing excellence. So we're trying to keep it very tight to the brief of what we're all about, and obviously we're supporting young people with the Future Leader Award, and that will be obviously part of the G4C movement that we've started to develop here in Norfolk. Special Recognition Award that has been won by some really significant people within our industry historically. Excellence in Business, so that's a combination of a few other awards, whether it be health and safety, people development and such like. But we see if people have got a good business, they can normally achieve the other things. So if we can recognise excellence in business as an overarching category, I think we will get some really good nominations and entries in that area. And we're just consolidating some of the mixture that we had of MMC and digital into innovation, sustainability and collaboration as the real key themes of our organisation's aims. And then another one that we used to have, but we sort of dropped it over the years, but Project of the Year. Quite simply, someone wants to celebrate a project that they've completed. And it could tick all of those boxes, or it could be other things that it's achieved in terms of its sort of outcomes. So they are the categories. We are making sure that it's free to enter for everybody, whether they're member organisations or not. We want to find as many great pieces of work in the region as we can find. So really today's call to action is that the sponsorship opportunities are now available for those awards. So there are less than there was before. Please let us know in good time. We're hoping to sort of finalise the numbers by the end of this week and into next week. There's information on our website, or email Teresa with your inquiry. It's only £250, but that does ensure that we can put a good night together really and enjoy everybody's award winners and things like that. Entry forms will be available hopefully by next week. We're just tweaking some of the questions and the wording on those, but they should be coming out very soon once we've got the sponsors lined up. And it also then gives the sponsors an opportunity to have their logo on the application forms. In March, obviously, we've had great levels of people interested in judging historically, so we won't be seeking those until sort of end of February, March time. So if you're interested in judging, bear in mind that there will be an opportunity to do that. And we're going to try and do it in a slightly different way this time, with some Teams calls and some Zoom meetings where people can actually, on the judging panels, have a bit of deliberation and debate over the nominations. So there's a bit more sort of conversation going on between us all. So that should be more interesting for everybody involved. So that's me done, the interesting bit now. But please, please, please check out the website. There's information will be appearing on there about the awards, and we'll be sort of feeding stuff through social media as well. But I'm going to start to slowly disconnect my share of the screen while Ed gets his piece of paper on the screen and starts talking to us. So Ed Gillespie, everybody, he's been with us before. It's his fourth time, so he obviously enjoys it. I know we do. And sit tight and enjoy the ride, I think really is the best way of putting it. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much indeed, Warren. So yes, it's a joy to be joining you for part 4 of Gillespie Provocation to start off 2022. I am now formally resident back in Norfolk after 30 years away, so I can speak with some degree of local credibility once again. I'm now back in Loddon. I'm not in the pub, as some people seem to think when they see the beams above my head. I am actually in what I jokingly call the Mill of Impermanence, which is Loddon Watermill, which is a lovely 300-year-old wooden building which straddles the River Chet. And it's only 8 feet above sea level. So let's hope we get this climate crisis under control. So my provocation for you to kick off 2022 is, what if we stopped building anything that wasn't fit for the future? Asking a very big and challenging question to kick things off, because I think we're all aware of how tough things have been over the last couple of years. I don't think 2022 is going to be any easier or smoother or simpler. It's going to be an ongoing build from where we've been. Now, you can't have been unaware of the big climate conference, COP26, which occurred in Glasgow last November, obviously with the UK as hosts. These processes are the best game we have in town in terms of multilateralism on climate change, but they are also fundamentally flawed in terms of delivering what needs to be done. And if you want to sort of have an outcome analysis of COP26, you can unpick the anagram that has now appeared on your screens. So it was difficult, and we knew it wasn't going to deliver probably what we wanted, not least because of the poverty of leadership we currently experience. You know, in the run up to the summit, our Prime Minister decided to pick a fight with Kermit the Frog at the United Nations, rambled about Peppa Pig, and the theme of COP was supposed to be coal, cars, cash and trees. Coal, because we wanted to shout about the fact that we've pretty much phased out coal in the UK. Cars, because electric vehicles is about the only target that we're actually on course to meet. The raising of £100 billion for climate adaptation and mitigation for the developing global south, and of course trees, because everyone loves trees. I probably realised it was not going to go according to plan when they announced the Wombles as the official mascots of COP26. He's like, I know the Wombles were great at recycling and recovering and making good use of the things that they found on Wimbledon Common, but I'm not sure Uncle Bulgaria was up for systemic transformation, which is unfortunately where the challenge currently lies. So those of you who are Squid Game fans, for the next game, keep messing with the climate and the survivors win. It really is getting down to squeaky bum time. Now, I've said this before, echoing the words of Extinction Rebellion, that this is not a drill, and yet we still seem to treat this as if it's some kind of dress rehearsal, even when the symptoms of the climate and ecological emergency intensify around us. I particularly enjoyed this tweet. This was from last autumn, where London Bridge flooded. Now, those of you who are aware of the hydrodynamics of bridges will realise that that's quite an achievement to flood a bridge with torrential rain, not from the river below. And as James Brooks pointed out, this is completely unacceptable disruption to hard-working people's lives here. If nature wants people to care more about it, this is totally the wrong way of going about doing things. I even understand there are much more disruptive actions planned. This is disgusting. So, again, the protest movements, which are currently being attempted to be kiboshed by the policing bill, are the necessary smoke alarm, the irritant in the room. They're not pleasant, they're not comfortable, but they're trying to tell us that the house is on fire. And I think in previous talks, I've talked about this as the apocalypse, not in terms of the end of the world, but as in terms of the drawing back of the veil, the revelation, the uncovering to see the world as it actually is. Because my job remains not to predict and analyse existing trends, but to stretch the imagination of the possible. That is the job of the responsible futurist. And in order to do that, you've got to listen very deeply and very intently to the real questions that the future is asking of you and is asking of us. And I gave a talk the last autumn and last November at Service Dealer Conference event, which is for sort of land management practices. There they were demonstrating this, which is a 125-mile-an-hour lawnmower. Now, I don't know what questions they think the future is asking of them, but I'm not sure it's, can we have an 125-mile-an-hour lawnmower, please? So we have to have a very different approach. As Charles Handy, the old school management guru, describes it, we're entering an age of unreason, actually, where in so many areas we're going to have to radically reshape the future. And that's going to require bold imagining in both private and public life for actually thinking the unlikely and doing the unreasonable. Which is one of the things that we focus on in the podcast I do with fellow reluctant futurist Mark Stevenson and comedian John Richardson, currently coming to the end of series 3 with series 4 in planning. And in that series, any of you who've tuned in previously will know that we tend to ask 3 questions. And pardon the French, but how fucked are we? Why are we fucked? And how do we unfuck ourselves? And I'm going to use that as a loose format for the rest of this talk. So how fucked are we? This is like your annual update from Ed on how fucked we are. And I think it's quite clear that we're in this long emergency now. And I keep talking about these integrated, interdependent challenges, but it's obvious that they're not going away. I mean, not least the kind of training day that COVID has been bringing very much to the fore for the last 2 years. And hopefully we are becoming into the tail end of that, but that's by no means guaranteed. And this training run, it reveals so many weaknesses in our system, both our leadership and our governance. We're currently running at around 200 deaths per 100,000 cases of COVID. And in Taiwan, it's 3.5 deaths per 100,000. But another comparable island nation, similar population densities, but for clearly very, very different cultural and practical responses. So if the UK had achieved the same death rate as Taiwan, we'd have suffered 2,330 deaths. So far, we've had 150,000. So this is scandalous, and we still don't talk about this in a way that we should, and in the sharp-edged way. As the British Medical Journal described it, as the government's COVID response is effectively social murder. And if that's not a damning indictment of where our leaders are taking us to, then I don't know what is. Because what COVID's done is do what Warren Buffett describes, is when the tide goes out, you realize who's swimming naked, you realize who's got no clothes on. And unfortunately, that receding tide has actually revealed all sorts of shortcomings in the way that we run the country and the world. Now, I've touched on climate change before as this sort of late to the party sort of panic mode, where we've been through all sorts of different phases and stages of soft denial to suddenly the shit metaphorically hitting the fan. And if you look at where the warming projections are now, this is from Climate Action Tracker, just updated just before Christmas, in the aftermath of COP26, you can see that the policies and action that we have committed are still taking us somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees. And there is this huge ambition gap of around 20 gigatons of carbon, which we need to be closing as soon as we possibly can to take us back down to a 1.5 degree threshold, which is what the Paris Agreement sets out. Now, 1.5 degrees, we are literally clinging to it with our fingernails now, because even with all of those other optimistic scenarios and the pledges and targets that people have made, we are still well short of the trajectory we should be on. And you can see the steepness of that curve that we need to meet. And climate change is different to other challenges we've faced. You know, it's not like the ozone layer, which is caused by one thing in one place and relatively easily fixed through the Montreal Protocol controlling CFCs and HCFCs. It's not like a war, because it's a war against ourselves. It's caused largely, at least, by our lifestyles. So we're all on the different sides at the same time. It's not like an asteroid, and we'll talk about Don't Look Up in a minute, because it has vested interests and it has a history. It's not an accident coming at us from intergalactic space. And it's not a problem. It is an era. It is a predicament. We keep on saying it's not here, it's not now, it's not me, it's not clear. It's here, it's now, it's us, it's clear. I don't know how we can spell that out any more transparently. And the thing is, temperatures are going to keep rising. We've added about 1.1 degrees since 1850. We're going to get 1.5 degrees at least by 2040 in even those optimistic scenarios. You probably saw the Guardian headline yesterday. It's actually the past 7 years have been the hottest on record. And as I say, we're well on course for 2 degrees. And so when you look at the banding of the colour here, it's only going to get warmer. The question is, how hot are we going to be able to allow it to get? And that has massive significance. I mean, when you've got temperatures hitting 50 degrees in subcontinental India, for example, this is in New Delhi, where it's hot enough to melt the tarmac on the streets. When you combine those hot temperatures with high humidity, we get what we call the wet bulb effect. And that causes people to die even when they're healthy. Because it basically, you lose the latent heat of evaporation. You cannot cool off. Your sweat does not evaporate in high humidity and those high temperatures, and so you literally expire. Many scientists are calling this conditions beyond human experience. And if anyone's read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, they will know that the opening chapter of that covers a devastating heat wave in India, which kills 2 million people. This is not sci-fi now. This is coming down the track. And that's not to touch on all of the other huge disasters we've seen, whether it's the fires that have raged from everywhere from California to Siberia to within Europe, Turkey, Greece, Portugal, and of course Australia, and also these severe storms, the tornadoes that hit the US outside of tornado season the other week, killing dozens of people, the floods in Germany. Basically, it's all getting pretty turbulent. And some of the analysts are saying we're heading towards an uninsurable world because the cost of those events is now becoming astronomical. It's climbing year on year. It's costing the global economy tens, if not hundreds of billions of pounds. So we've said this, that climate change is a threat multiplier because it makes all of the other things harder to deal with. It's possibly the greatest risk management failure in history. And I did some work with the European Council for Internal Auditors, and they now describe climate change as a principal and forever risk. i.e. it's not going away and it should be central to all of our decision making, which is why I'm asking the rhetorical question at the start of this talk. What if we only stopped building anything that wasn't fit for the future? Because those auditors also revealed that in large organizations, there's a great kind of unanimity. 58% people think climate change will be a high risk in 3 years' time. Over half say they've not discussed that with their audit committee. And again, over half say that their internal audit function is doing very limited or no work related to climate change. So again, we're sleepwalking into the darkness. We're talking the talk, but we're not actually changing the prioritization and the focus on what we do. Because climate change is not like the civil rights movement. It's not like the suffragettes. It's not like the self-liberation of an oppressed group. It's going to require us to be selfless. It's going to require an intergenerational perspective, and it has to enable us to look after and look out for the interests and needs of others, both human and non-human, who are not us, people in other parts of the world and the wider family of life, and who are often unable to defend themselves. And I think in my first talk, we did talk about flood risk, but when you look at the 2050 map of Norfolk, and you see, and Loddon, where I live, is just obviously right on the edge of that flood area. It does become quite significant, and this is closer than we think, obviously within potentially 25 years. Those of you who've been following the news will also be aware of what they call the Doomsday Glacier, the Thwaites Glacier, down in Antarctica, which is such a vast volume of water currently held on the edge of that Antarctic landmass. But people talk about, if this goes, then we start to talk about a rapid shift in sea level rise, not 2050. People saying this could destabilize within the next 5 or 10 years. So there's going to be non-linear risks and impacts that we also have to confront. And again, I've said it previously, but we're in the pandemic wave, but we are struggling in an economic recession with the climate change wave and the biodiversity collapse wave coming up rapidly behind. Now, William Burroughs once famously observed, he said, after one look at this planet, any visitor from outer space would say, I want to see the manager. What are you guys playing at here? And that alien perspective would probably be asking some difficult questions, or certainly saying these guys are amateurs. What are they doing? They're turning environmental degradation into short-term profit for a very small number of the born lucky. Now, that doesn't seem to be a competent way to run a small, fragile blue sphere and the third planet in the solar system. So again, we reiterate this point, but it is us having to stare up our own fundament and to try and reimagine and to do things radically differently. So that's how fucked we are. So why are we this fucked? What is it that keeps dragging us back to this same position? Well, I mean, for starters, I think we've all started to appreciate the pointlessness of some aspects of our work. The biggest global state of the workplace report from Gallup shows that 80% of employees are not engaged or indeed actively disengaged at work. And that disengagement is a symptom, not a root cause of employee dissatisfaction. It's like we're worried that most of the stuff we do has no meaning. Plus, we're seeing this bifurcation of jobs, this massive stratification, a hollowing out of the middle class, leaving a sort of underskilled precariat of key workers who are underpaid and underappreciated, whilst actually most of us white collar types have done rather well during the pandemic because we've had comfortable, secure incomes and we've been able to live it up a little from our houses. It's not the same if you've been perched with a laptop on your knee on the edge of the bed in a house you share with members of other households or your own family. And the trouble is that bifurcation of jobs is only going to get worse. And there's no trajectory for promotion in this context. So it's highly unlikely that an Uber driver becomes an Uber coder in the old school way where we might have hoped to rise up through the ranks. This also shows in the fact that the quit rate is at an all-time high. People are voluntarily quitting their jobs. It's at 3%. So it's people are actually ditching the work they don't like and trying to move on and find something with a bit more purpose. People call this the Great Resignation. When the cost of recruitment is about 122% of the annual salary of that role, that also has huge costs as people move and shift around, or indeed go and start their own companies. And in the context of the built environment, which is obviously the focus of you guys, it's clear that we can't do the climate transition without an enormous seismic transition within the built environmental sector. So, we're still looking at the carbon emissions from building operations and constructions reaching their highest levels ever recorded in 2019, which is around 10 gigatons of carbon a year, or 38% of global CO2 emissions. So it's enormous. And that has to come down very rapidly. When you look at the Committee on Climate Change's work, what we're seeing is actually a slight decline in terms of the annual emissions, but the change in emissions from the building sector is really, really small. It actually is not going anywhere near fast enough. And when you look at the pathways that the Committee on Climate Change starts to set out, what you see is that most of those built environmental things are also coming down well behind schedule. And if we just take heat pumps, which has obviously been something which has been in the news a bit, if you look at the government commitment, it's to do 600,000 heat pump installations a year in the next 5 years by 2028. That is still below the Committee on Climate Change pathway of 900,000. So it's 50% lower than that. And we should be hitting over 1 million installations a year by 2030. We're currently doing 22,000 a year. And even France is doing 10 times more than us at 275,000 per year. And those low carbon heat networks, where you should be, government is committed to 2 terawatt hours. The Committee on Climate Change says 25 terawatt hours of low carbon heat networks. So even these commitments are falling short of the required pathways. And remember, these are only commitments. They don't actually have the credible plans to deliver them. So I hate to say it, ladies and gentlemen, but we're not even close. We are quite happily fiddling whilst Rome burns. And as Upton Sinclair observed, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And so we are still caught in this trap of our own bribery as reward for doing the things that we know are not helping. Which brings me to Don't Look Up, which I'm sure many of us watched over Christmas. And for those like me who've spent the last 25 years working on climate change, it was a sort of scary resonance of the kind of increasingly desperate tone of our communications, trying to get people to wake up to the severity and urgency of an existential crisis. If you haven't watched it, I thoroughly recommend you do. It's a very, very dark satire. But as I said, climate change is not an asteroid, because it's not an intergalactic accident. It is something which has vested interests and a deep history, because we've been aware of this risk for over 150 years now. And what Don't Look Up touches on is this notion of willful blindness, is that legal principle that you are responsible if you could have known and should have known something which instead you strove not to see. And that is going to lead to a huge raft of climate litigation, which is just starting to gear up now. There are around 1,800 lawsuits globally, increasingly being focused towards the fossil fuel, oil and gas giants in particular, because of their knowing denial and indeed active obfuscation of the challenge. And as Margaret Heffernan, who I work with at the Forward Institute, says, the truth won't set us free until we develop the skills, the habits and the talents, but perhaps most importantly, the moral courage to use it. And I wrote a piece last August around the omerta of so much consultancy, this sort of code of silence, this mafia inability to speak out, because we're all in a kind of complicit relationship with each other. And what is required is for both clients and consultants to speak out and step out beyond the constraints of where they currently find themselves. We need more outspoken truth telling, because we're also being sold a lie in the fact that this is going to be an easy techno-utopian transition. And there is an enormous honesty gap coming from our political leaders, who seem to be implying that we can seamlessly segue from internal combustion engine to electric vehicle, from fossil fuels to renewables, without there being any costs to that. And that's not true. This is going to get bumpy. As Adam Kay said in his Secret Diaries of a Junior Doctor, this is going to hurt. And I think we need to be more honest about the places where it's going to be difficult, where those transitions might be a little bit painful. And at the same time, you have the madness of consumerism still being used to kind of offer an escape route out of the pandemic, to keep shopping, to get out there and buy more stuff, whilst at the same time that ecological emergency is ongoing. And those of you who've watched the movie The Big Short about the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 will know that what happened in the trading of those collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps was that all of those transactions were taking place without the requisite financial capital underpinning them. And when the music stopped, the whole thing fell over. Essentially, what we're engaged in at the moment is a big short of ecology. There is not the requisite natural capital to underpin the current levels of economic activity in the system. We are living on ecological debt and ecological overshoot, and sooner or later that whole system starts to crumble. And part of that is also attributed to our failure to think long term. Native Americans talk about 7-generation thinking, not necessarily 7 generations hence, but certainly with us as a pivotal generation between our great grandparents and our great grandchildren, where we should be thinking at least about the decisions we make, where we are looking at that transformation of the world our great grandparents lived in, which was very different to the one that we enjoy, but also trying to put in place those criteria and those shifts that will benefit our great grandchildren. And we might be privileged to actually experience that span of influence within our own families. And it's weird coming back after 30 years away. I mean, when I was a teenager, I had some of the worst jobs in the world. I worked scraping rust off the top of Sizewell B. I worked on oil rig accommodation units with SLP in Lowestoft. And now East Anglia, has pretty much the highest number of offshore wind farms in the entire world. And plus the whole vineyard industry, which is a kind of slightly weird benefit of climate change, has kicked off. And I'm now surrounded by great winemaking country. So it's extraordinary to see what has happened over those 30 years that I've been away, and as I'm returning here. One of the errors that the offshore industry has made, I believe, is the fact that there is still no direct community ownership or engagement, which I think is scandalous, because there is no sovereign wealth fund for wind, as Norway has generated with fossil fuels. Why are we not including the local people into the benefits that this enormous industry has brought to the country? And of course, we're still fighting rearguard actions on the usual madness you see written about renewable energy. Apparently, solar panels could make horses blind. Who knew? And there is good news, building on that. If you look at the Renewable 21 Global Status Report, it's quite upbeat in some ways, but we have to have a massive caveat to this as well, because in 2009, fossil fuels made up 80.3% of the global energy mix. And in 2019, they made up 80.2% of the global energy mix. So in a decade, we've taken 0.1% off the fossil fuel share of that global energy market. As my colleague at Greenpeace, the executive director, John Sovan, wryly noted, we're going to have to speed that one up a bit. So whilst renewables are growing at 3 times as fast as fossil fuels, about 5% a year, fossil fuels are still growing at 1.7% a year. And also during that time, global energy demand has increased. So whilst we should celebrate all this heroic renewable energy, it's all additional and it's not yet displacing fossil fuels. One of the key things we have got to stop doing is stop doing the bad stuff. It's not just good enough to do the good stuff on top of that. It's got to be displacements, because we're now still burning more fossil fuels than ever before, which is pretty sobering. And at the same time, as I said, in terms of this long emergency and the kind of volatility and disruption which is likely to come through the courts, as well as through protests and other forms of pressure, we could be looking at a fossil fuel asset crash, because as this transition really starts to gather momentum, many of those assets will be stranded and indeed valueless. So half the world's fossil fuel assets could become worthless in the next decade or so. And of course, they knew it all was all coming. So I have little empathy and sympathy for the squeeze that many of these big players are now feeling. We've just seen the cancellation of the Cambo field in Shetland. And at the same time, you know, our digital world and our online world is now suffering the same sort of strangulation by large players squatting on our data and essentially using that in a brutally extractive fashion in the same way that fossil fuel industries have done. And they know exactly what they're doing. And this is the next sort of level of scandal. Mark Zuckerberg is promising us the metaverse, which will probably just be used for people to do all the same things that they do really badly online, which is try and sell us things to show people their private parts or to spread disinformation. And the other thing I observe in moving back to East Anglia is also the banality of development, is seeing these identikit estates bolted onto villages like the one in which I now live in Loddon. And there is something very serious going wrong here, where I just joined the kind of neighbourhood development plan committee for the new Loddon development plan. And I've tried to push the fact that we should be doing everything net zero right now. You know, line in the sand. And I've got into huge arguments with Tory councillors, it has to be said, who are saying, you know, still peddling the same old lies that you can't have sustainable and affordable. Now, this is going to be how we unfuck ourselves. This is the final part of the talk, because this is where we have to really operate the step change, because what this long emergency is doing is holding up a mirror. It's a dark mirror to us. Do we see Narcissus in that mirror? Are we in love with our own reflection, or do we see catharsis and the need to change? And as David Attenborough said, many individuals are really doing what they can, but real success can only come if there is a change in our societies, in our economics and in our politics. Because I've touched on this before, we need to be getting into the regenerative space. It is not enough just to be doing damage limitation. Sustainability is merely a stepping stone on the journey towards regenerative from degenerative. And that is the only future. And right now we are still stuck in doing the same things slightly less badly. One of the things which has been exercising me is refurb. And refurbishment, to stop knocking down fundamentally useful buildings which have vast amounts of embodied carbon already in them. How do we reimagine, reinvent and refresh redundant spaces? This is the hideous concrete carbuncle of Camden Town Council, just opposite King's Cross Station in London. You may be familiar with this building, just been refurbed into a wonderful design hotel. 94% of the primary structural elements retained, a reinvention and a reimagination of what was a pretty awful building. Now, we should be doing that by default. Perversely, the government charges 20% VAT on all refurb. And yet new build construction is currently at 0% VAT. We need to reverse that incentivization. We actually need to be having 0% VAT on any kind of refurbishment or reimagination and putting 20% VAT on new build. Now, you should be lobbying for that. Make your voices heard to incentivize this reuse of existing building stocks, because it's actually essential that we reverse those incentives. I've talked about ply scrapers previously, but this is now totally coming of age. The era of cross-laminated timber innovation is genuinely with us. People go, oh, well, those wooden buildings don't last. Well, I live in a 300-year-old wooden building. It seems to be doing quite well. It's going to last a lot longer than many of the new builds, I imagine, which are going up these days. Plus, I always go back to this Ying County pagoda on the left here in China, which was built, wait for it, in the year 1056. Yes, that's the year 1056. So a decade before the Norman invasion, the Chinese were building this wonderful pagoda. So wooden buildings can last, and they are durable and beautiful, and they're going to be the future because they have so much less embodied carbon. We haven't yet got our first supply scraper in the UK, but the plans are starting to emerge. This was the Oakwood Timber Tower that was put forward for the Barbican. The closest we have so far is this Transport for London building, which will be a timber hybrid building with about 40% less embodied carbon and 40% less running costs, because it's going to be extracting heat from Southwark Tube Station below. But this is the cutting edge, and this is not net zero. And that's the problem, is like we're still playing catch up. This is the extent of our ambitions right now, and very quickly this has to be the absolute bog standard, and indeed the bog standard has to be much more innovative than this. We've also had arguments around Goldsmith Street in Norwich, again locking horns with the local councillor, who talked about the excessive cost of building this. But the trouble is, it's getting the economics wrong. Because when the average household's energy bills are hitting £2,000 a year, if it costs an extra 20,000 quid to build a passive house, then actually what we're getting is a 10-year payback. Because when you bring those energy bills right down, those extra investment costs pay off quite quickly. And it's all around us. I mean, I've also been surprised to discover a passive house development that was built in Ditchingham, just down the road from me here, 10 years ago. So, you know, all of this is well within our grasp and well within our capacity. Because what the point I'm trying to make here is that any investment of time or money that doesn't consider either human health, the environment, is not an investment. It's a cost on the future. Because everything we're building now, which is not passive house or net zero, is a cost. Because we're going to have to bring it back to that standard within the next 10 years. So we're operating right now with loads of false economies and actually undermining our own resilience, actually undermining our own capacity to cope with the changes which are coming. And some of that, you know, back to our coals, cars, cash and trees, will come down to rewilding and replanting and changing land use patterns in East Anglia, which I think is very exciting when you look at the potential for agroforestry and changes in land use away from these monocultural arable expanses of basically biodiversity deserts to much more productive permacultural biodiverse land, where we can actually get more units of food and calories out of the same area of land, probably with more human and less fossil fuel input, but at the same time bring nature back into our landscapes. And the converse is happening in cities in terms of what we call the 15-minute city. I mean, Norwich may only be a 15-minute city just because of its relatively modest size. But the work of Carlos Moreno in Paris in terms of rethinking zoning in cities is also fascinating. So basically deconstructing these old 60s and 70s ideas, having this sort of anti-zoning approach, very much mixed use, multi-use hybrid spaces, bringing farming and cultivation back into the city and putting culture and creativity at the absolute heart. And what is, I think, really exciting, if you look at what's happening in terms of the way we are now working, because we're involved now in a huge ongoing hybrid experiment of whether we go back to the workplace or whether we continue to explore this new dynamic of working from home with dramatically reduced amounts of office space. Now, the City of London is already looking to create 1,500 homes from empty offices. We have the possibility here, through refurbishment and reimagination, to solve our housing crisis, to end homelessness, to reduce the amount of commercial real estate required, and to basically bring a new dynamism back into our cities. It really could be a win-win-win-win-win type of ambition. And many businesses are already out of the starting gates on this. Nationwide, the world's biggest building society with 13,000 staff has told them, beyond branch staff, that they can work anywhere. They are not requiring a single employee to come back to the office if they don't want to. This also makes recruitment for talent much easier because people can work from wherever they are in the UK. They don't have to up routes and shift around. Now, these guys are on one extreme, but the implications of this in terms of reimagining and releasing the previous office estates that they had means that is now available for other use. Of course, there's got to be a balance. You know, we don't all want to be stuck in the Zombie apocalypse forever, because that wouldn't be much fun either. But certainly this hybrid working genie is out of the bottle, and it will not go back in, I don't think. I think even those of us who are desperate to go back to the office in some way, shape or form will probably still opt for a day or two a week at home. And there'll be every single option along that spectrum of never going back to going back full time. Of course, at the other extreme, you have people like Goldman Sachs who can't wait to get everyone back in the boiler room. But that probably says more about their working culture and their need to brainwash their employees to behave massively irresponsibly in the interests of financial benefit and remuneration than it does about any other practicalities. So to conclude, we're still on that cusp of sort of breakdown versus change as usual versus breakthrough. The change as usual still takes us to the breakdown point. It just delays it a little bit further down the track. As I've said before, it's like we often think of change as like phyletic gradualism, where it happens in nice, smooth, manageable transitions and curves. The uncomfortable truth is it's usually punctuated equilibria, where we go through periods of stability and then periods of rapid, disruptive, transformative change. And that's where we're at right now, because the future is out there. It's just not evenly distributed yet, as William Gibson said, but equally the collapse is out there. It's just not evenly distributed yet. There really is this quixotic mix of both hope and fear, where we can see what we need to do, and we actually have the tangible practical examples that illustrate that, and yet we're still not doing it at the scale and urgency required. And it's not surprising, as Don't Look Up illustrates, that when we actually confront the reality of this challenge, that we experience a whole bunch of different emotions, you know, from anxiety to grief to rage to guilt to doom, still some elements of denial. But what we can't lurch back into is psychic knowing. And I think the climate psychologist Caroline Hickman best sums this up for me when she said, you know, you should imagine we are scuba diving, because when you're diving and something goes wrong underwater, you have a very strict protocol to avoid a hazardous situation becoming a dangerous one, which is stop, breathe, think, connect and act. And that's not a bad guidance on how we should be responding to the climate, because we all have power in this. You know, I think we're all feeling a little bit powerless, that our hands are tied, that we're stuck in a system that can't change, and we have to get over ourselves, because, as Alice Walker said, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. So we need to lobby, we need to pressure government, we need to work with our clients and our customers, and we need to reimagine and reinvent so many of these things. And that's going to involve us being creative. As Thomas Mann said, art is to the community what the dream is to the individual. How do we imagine this future? How do we ask the what if questions in a way that genuinely leads to tangible change? And I'll finish on this, because I've spoken at a couple of smart cities conferences at the tail end of last year, and I was really struck at like the idiocy of a lot of the technology that was on display at these smart cities events. And as the Greek philosopher Thales said, we live not in reality on the summit of a solid earth, but at the bottom of an ocean of air. And a couple of years ago, I went to this extraordinary thing at the Saatchi Gallery, which was a virtual reality installation where you donned your virtual reality headgear. You could see your breath, you could see the blood and the oxygen flowing through the blood vessels in your hands. And you could go inside a giant sequoia tree and essentially see how the interdependence of your own relationship with that tree through your breath and the water cycle was this beautiful and indivisible type of link. And it was actually quite a profound emotional experience to be able to, as an ecologist, immerse yourself in all of those processes that you know are going on every day and every moment of your life, but to actually be able to visualize them through the virtual reality. And it's what Marshmallow Laser Feast, the artists and innovators behind it, call XR, extended reality. How do we have experiences which extend our consciousness, extend our sensory perception, extend our sense of identity and connection and well-being with the world beyond us? And it's what my friend Tom Mansfield calls heart-led technology, which is technology in service of something deeper than just the wants and mores of the mind, or that dopamine satisfaction of retail, browsing, gaming, or any other synthesized gratifications. And in that sense, and I challenged a hall in Barcelona at the world's biggest smart city expo. I said, imagine how different the exhibition hall outside would look if we developed the technologies there through a lens of heart-led technology. Because if we're not careful, we're going to be developing smart cities which are inherently dumb and brittle and fragile. There are certain things where there is an elegant simplicity required that makes far, far more sense than some rather precarious technology. And perhaps the most beautiful illustration of this is the Indian rubber tree bridges in north eastern India, where using the kind of natural growth of the fig tree around a very basic bamboo frame creates a bridge which is rust resilient, which resists the flow of the floodwaters during the monsoon and grows stronger with age and with each passing year. And it's those kind of working with the grain and the graft of nature that we would probably do well to apply as we look towards tomorrow. So Greta has been staring at us and staring at this climate change challenge for a long time. And I've been working on it since before she was born. Greta is now 18 years old, that little schoolgirl who went on school strike outside the Swedish Parliament is now entering into young adulthood. That's how long she's been on the scene already. And we're still not bending the curve in the way that we could or should. But perhaps her biggest gift is not to look away from this challenge. Her autistic spectrum gifts mean that she has to continue to confront it on a daily basis. And we would do well not to look away either. And I'll leave you with a quote from Ivan Illich, the kind of philosopher, who said, "I believe a desirable future depends on our deliberately choosing a life of action over a life of consumption, on engendering a lifestyle which will enable us to be spontaneous, independent, yet related to each other, rather than maintaining a lifestyle which only allows us to produce and consume." We have everything we need. We have the ability to do far, far more with far, far less. And whether it's the buildings we construct, the ones we refurb, the way we work, the where we work, the how we work and the what we work on, all of those things start to become integrated. So we can look towards a future which has less commuting, less wasted time, less pointless travel and hypermobility, less stress, exhaustion, burnout, less energy, less carbon, less materials and less land take and less cost in all of the things around the built environment that we might envisage. And at the same time, we can then get more time, flexibility, focus, connection, home time, space for nature, imagination, and investment in the future we actually need. So when I asked that rhetorical question right at the start, what if we stopped building anything that wasn't fit for the future? I'm kind of serious, because if not now, when? And if not you, who? So I'll finish on that. Only the impossible is interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. That was marvellous. We've got a few questions coming through, but just before we go to them, so if you can familiarise maybe yourself with the chat screen so you can see them as well, that are answered directly. So what's next for you then? What are you up to this year? What can we be looking out for?
What's next for me? Well, as I say, we'll be finishing off season 3 of the Futurenauts and season 4. We are currently recruiting a new executive director of Greenpeace UK. So I'm hoping to see a next evolution of radicalism from those campaigners. I'm continuing to work with the Forward Institute on responsible leadership, working with 40 of the UK's biggest institutions and being professionally gobby on any platform or stage that will have me. I'm being a dad. I'm in parenting. I'm a full-time single dad. So, apart from all of those other things, there is a small 4-year-old lady who preoccupies most of my attention.
Brilliant. So can you see some of those questions there? We've got one from Jan Davis. I think it's the first one on the list there.
Where do I go to get in the chat?
Oh, you can't see it. I'll try and read it with my dyslexic mind. So the Great Norwich Local Plan examinations hearings are starting in February. How can we ensure future build within the GNLP energy efficient in the way that Ed is energy efficient in the way that you are urging? It seems the construction sector needs to speak up and agree a way forward. Otherwise, the changes urgently needed will not happen. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think
how we form policy, and obviously, as you said earlier, that someone who's paid to do a certain thing, they're not going to not do what they're paid to do. So there is a conflict there for many people, I guess, isn't there, as well?
I genuinely think this is a mobilization moment. It's about being as vocal and challenging and provocative as possible. Because if you look, I mean, you know, my family have a small piece of woodland at Rackheath on the outskirts of Norwich, and you look at the developments going up all around that sort of northeastern corner. It's quite extraordinary to see the lack of imagination, never mind just the building energy standards, but just the creativity failure of building another suburban commuter style estate, where in the teeth of a challenge where, as I said, with this hybrid working world, we could be seeing all of this change. It's what I've been saying in Loddon. It's like, why are we not building live work units? Why are we not building a very different, you know, type of infrastructure for people who actually want to stay in the village, and people who will be probably working at least half of their time from home, or indeed starting other businesses here? And so what we're building right now is not fit for purpose, let alone on the climate, on carbon basis. It's not fit for social purpose. You know, it's not fit for the way that our lives have changed and will be continuing to change, I suspect. And so, as I say, I think this is a mobilisation moment. You've got to speak to the MPs, you've got to speak to the councillors, you've got to speak to your professional colleagues, you've got to amplify your professional voice, because if you are an integral member of this trade and this sector and this industry, then you've got to step up. I mean, and I just offer as an example, I mean, on the refurb piece, the Futurenauts, Mark and I, we did a piece for Mace, you know, one of the UK's biggest construction companies. And we've now got them on the case. You know, they're lobbying for this reversal of, you know, VAT on refurbishment versus VAT on new build. But and even if it's a ratchet, you know, even if it changed at 2.5% a year, so we gradually cut the VAT by 2.5% a year on refurbishment and increase it by 2.5% a year. By 2030, you know, we get to a reversal of that scenario. The industry adapts, but be creative. Be lobby, make yourself heard, say that this is what the industry wants, and make it uncomfortable for yourselves, because it's going to be.
There's a comment here from Ian Fox. It's quite the gist of it. Basically, is obviously we all recognise there is stuff to do, but there's countries like China and India and the USA who maybe have very different agendas to us, and they have a scale and a mass that can certainly dent any progress made. So I think his sentiment is if we go down, we all go down. But it's very difficult with major nations not necessarily sort of joining the party, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, it's the oldest trick in the book, isn't it? To say, but they're doing it, miss, so I'm not going to, or I'm going to carry on behaving. I mean, yes, with the best will in the world, if you look at it in the big scheme of things, the UK is responsible for 2 or 3% of global carbon, and so we are not where the change is made. That said, every single nation on that carbon ladder of commitments always points towards the nations above them and blames them. And also it becomes very different when you look at the responsibility for historical emissions, of which the US and the UK bear a far bigger share of the burden. So I don't think, in all honesty, we can ever say that, you know, changing what we do in Norfolk will change the world, but that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do.
I agree. There's a few bits of chat going on there. So what I'm proposing to do, rather, obviously I'm just conscious of time for everybody, that we had an hour put aside for this today, if that's okay with you, Ed, we'd like to put some stuff on LinkedIn about today's session. So please, everybody, maybe put your comments on the chat, and we can have an ongoing debate online where people can have a two-way conversation and more people can contribute in that way. So once again, thank you very much, Ed. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you again with us. And obviously, we'd really like to thank our sponsors today, Redhead Architects and John Norcliffe, for procuring your services also as well, which has been very much appreciated. So thank you very much to Redhead. Again, sponsorship is key to ensuring we can run the club efficiently. Just a quick heads up for some of the younger members maybe on the call today, or some of the senior leaders in organisations with youngsters in their businesses. So G4C is our Generation for Change, quite apt for today. It's a network that we're sort of supporting. It's part of the Constructing Excellence Network. We've been having regular social events through last year when appropriate and possible, but we're proposing to do something in February. So basically this network is aimed at people with maybe less than 10 years experience in the industry, probably can't say an age, but probably under 35. It's a great opportunity for them just to grow in terms of their network, their skills in terms of meeting people and talking about their profession, but also longer term get together in terms of moving forward with some change within the industry and becoming sort of members of the committee here at Constructing Excellence and leaders in their own businesses. So hopefully you can support that in February. There'll be some information coming out on the date for that later this week or in early part of next week. So that's pretty much all we've got time for today. Thank you very much. We will probably have an event next month. We're just waiting to get a confirmation on our speaker. Hope you've enjoyed the session. The slide deck will be available, but I think it's best viewed as a video because there's so many words that accompany it rather than the slides themselves. So bear with us as we get those available, and look forward to seeing you all again next time. Thank you very much.